Hi, I'm Russell Witte, professor at the University of Arizona. My primary appointment is in medical imaging, which is also known as radiology. I'm also have appointments in College of Optical Sciences, Department of Biomedical Engineering, and most recently an appointment in neurosurgery. My PhD is from Arizona State University, where I worked with microelectrode technology and the brain. And then I went to University of Michigan as a postdoc where I worked in an ultrasound lab for 5 years and developed different types of imaging techniques that involved ultrasound, light, microwave technology, electricity, which I eventually then went to the University of Arizona and I continue to develop imaging modalities, medical imaging techniques that use these types of energies. I also have a startup company, Electrosonics, and neither the University of Arizona, my presentation today does not necessarily reflect the views of the University of Arizona or Electrosonics. And my interest in this area, because I do work with imaging, I'm very privy to safety regulations involving developing new modalities, and so I've become very familiar in recent years with a vast body of literature that relates to my talk. I'm also very interested in the concepts of using electricity and magnetism for healing and treatment, although that's not directly related to my research. In addition to how electricity may impact the body and the health in both positive and negative ways. And my presentation today will reflect my background and interests in this area. So my talk will really be, not everything about electricity is necessarily bad on the body. And I think a lot of the things that got me interested was all the different things in the history of using electricity for healing and for treatment that many of us are not aware of, and there's actually a rich history of this. So I'm actually starting with a little bit going in that direction, which will be a little bit different than maybe other people presenting this material. And really the last half, maybe more than half, will focus on microwave radiation in particular, and things that kind of take home messages we all need to be thinking about, okay? And okay. So I want to start with the idea, is electricity the key to life? And to ask that question, I want to think about in terms of typical models that we have in biology and of the human body and how electricity fits into that model, because this is fundamentally important. If we're going to talk about how electricity interacts with the body, we got to think about the models that we're using today and how that relates to how we think about electricity. And the first slide I want to bring up, on the left, you see maybe a conventional image of a cell. You might find a picture of a cell in a biology textbook or physiology, right? You can identify all these parts often under a microscope and explain what function they have. And it's kind of like a mechanical sort of view of the cell or the body or the organ or the organism. And that's really very much traditional how our medical system thinks today in terms of a chemical model. However, it's really not completely based on reality, or if it is, it's way oversimplified to actually what's going on with that cell. And you just have to turn to the actual structure of the atom to understand that. So the picture of the atom, what I'm emphasizing here is if you just put the particles together, the electron, the neutron, and the proton, and you look how much that encloses the volume of an atom, it's almost zero, which means almost the entire volume of every atom in your body, in your cell, or in the universe is almost entirely empty space. Now, it turns out that empty space is not really nothing. In fact, it has a huge amount of energy, which is going to relate to why this is so important when we think about the body. And I want to just make it clear that a chemical system, and on the right I'm showing a pH scale, which comes from any sort of chemistry book, relates directly to electricity and specifically into volts or electric potential. There's a one-to-one equivalent between the pH scale and a voltage scale. That's also very important, okay? And I have a quote here, and this has been known for a long time, but this is from a book by Oshman called Energy Medicine. It says, there are two ways of altering functions in the body. One is to add particular molecules to the system, and the other is to add the electromagnetic signature of those molecules. Now, those are essentially equivalent. You can actually create effects of a drug or a molecule using electricity and magnetism if you understand the signature. I want to look at it one other way, and let's look at chemistry starts with the periodic table. Okay, so those are the elements, and those are, each of those represent an atom, but what I just talked about is the atom is much more complicated than each of those elements. In fact, you've got these particles whizzing around at the speed of light, and the dynamics inside each one of those atoms can change depending on the environment. And in fact, all the great physicists understood this: Einstein, Tesla, Max Planck. They said it's not about the mass, the matter, it is the energy that holds the atom together. And we're all composed of atoms. Our chair that we're sitting on, everything is composed of atoms, and it's about the energy and not the mass or the molecules themselves. And this quote by Max Planck down there basically says energy. And since this is an abbreviated version, I would go into quite a bit more detail and understanding what the energy is, because the energy, the emptiness, the vacuum inside the atom has a huge amount of energy that nobody wants to talk about. And the Nobel Prize winning discoveries of great physicists in the 1960s, those discoveries have never made it into the biology or medical textbooks. We're still using antiquated, outdated models that don't recognize the great discoveries of the physicists. Richard Feynman, for example, many great physicists, they have not gotten into our biology textbooks. So they're simplified or broken models of the human body. Now, just to show one example of how you can see an energy field or electricity coming from the body. These are taken using Kirlian photography. This has been around a long time, but it's basically a type of long exposure photography. You can see these fields around adamant and inanimate objects. There are books written hypothesizing that you can look at the fields around your hand or the human body, like you see on the right, as a predictor of certain sorts of disease or an indicator of certain types of disease. And then there are things that you can do to try to repair that field and recover in terms of healing. And so that's related to Kirlian photography. These are actual fields you can measure and take pictures of that you normally would not see with your eyes, but you take pictures with. Okay, so when we talk about the electromagnetic spectrum and scale, this particular figure is showing, I want to emphasize a couple things in particular, and one is the wavelength. So the period of that wave, as you're going from left to right, is going from a very long wave that could be one cycle could be on the scale of an entire building. Here I'm referring that as a radio wave. And you can go up the scale. You can see microwaves would come in the centimeter to millimeter scales. And then you get into infrared visible light. You get into ultraviolet, X-ray, and gamma rays as the highest kind of frequencies that we'd normally recognize. Each of those frequencies there relates to a wavelength, which you see at the bottom. And I've kind of boxed out microwaves, which we'll get to later on. But I also want to point out one other distinction here, and that is non-ionizing versus ionizing. So we all might remember the discoveries of X-rays in the 1800s, Röntgen and Tesla in particular. They made the discovery, they didn't know what it was exactly. Röntgen was mystified. He did interviews explaining, I don't know what it is, but it's amazing, isn't it? Okay, so people played with X-rays. We know that well over 500 scientists lost their lives due to X-ray radiation because they didn't know what they were working with. There's a museum in Germany that commemorates those scientists. But even many decades after we knew that X-ray, ionizing radiation, was damaging, we still had doctors recommending your annual X-ray exam. Even into the 1970s, we also had devices in shoe stores to look at children's feet using X-rays to measure the size of their foot before they got a shoe. That was well into 1970. So even though there were dangers, there were recognized harm from X-rays, we still continued to use them until the public perception of X-rays and the science caught up to what the field knew a long time. Now, ionizing simply means that there's enough energy in the wavelength or the frequency to knock an electron off the orbit. That's all it means. And when you can knock an electron off the orbit, you can create certain damage like DNA damage that can be very harmful. Usually we think of those as free radicals or other things that can be harmful for the body, and that's established. We understand that. Non-ionizing means that the wavelength is just not able to knock an electron. It doesn't have enough energy to do that. However, there are many other things that energy can do, as we know very well, as I will show some examples to, that can be actually helpful or actually harmful to the body, depending on the type of energy. But it gets more complicated. An electromagnetic wave is not just about its frequency or wavelength. In fact, there are many components to the wave that makes this field much more complicated than, say, studying a drug, right? You have a drug, and you want to test it on an animal or a person. You can decide what kind of dose you want to give the drug and how you want to deliver the drug, right? So there's a few parameters you can use. With an electromagnetic wave, there are many other parameters to consider, but also more difficult to control. And I'm listing those there. You can think about the frequency, which was on the previous slide. You can think about the amplitude, intensity. These are all different parts, uniquely different parts of the wave. The beat, the pulsing aspect, modulation can give you information in the way that signal is amplitude modulated. We know that from radio signals and frequency modulated radio, FM radio. You also have a spatial radiation pattern, and you also have the polarity of the wave. Now, all of these can affect a biological system. We know that. I also want to add, to do a controlled experiment with these waves with so many different parameters and different possibilities is not an easy thing to do. Just replicating the same experiment with the same investigators in the same lab isn't necessarily trivial. It's complicated. And if you have somebody, say, on the other side of the world in Australia trying to replicate your experiment, and the humidity in the room is slightly different, it could affect your results. So applying a traditional scientific method is simply more complicated when you think of replication. So you got to think of the entirety and the whole when we do look at the literature. Now, even by 1910, electricity was extremely popular for healing. The greatest doctors, medical doctors, and the engineers had regular conferences together, sharing their experiences on patients on how to build better devices to help with their patients. These are two books which you can find, you can download. Some of these have several hundred pages, and they talk about how to use electricity from literally foot to head, back to foot again, every part of the body, whether it's surgery, non-invasive. They were seeing all kinds of dramatic effects. They didn't completely understand how they worked, but the impacts on the patients were remarkable, okay? Nikola Tesla developed devices. Many people at that time were developing devices. You can look in the Sear Roebuck's catalogs back in the day, and you'll find pages and pages of devices that allopathic doctors used routinely, more than half of them at that time, allopathic, for treatment. I cannot get into the history of electromedicine in this talk, but there is a history. There's a reason why these things were phased out. It was the period around 1910 which we saw a lot of things happening politically in this country, specifically with pharmaceutical medicine, and changing the environment and the focus of healing from what was very common at that time in naturopathic healing and using things like light and electricity to using pharmaceutical drugs. But there is a rich history. Everyone should be familiar with it. I think it's exciting and interesting to look into this and to talk about it. But these things didn't completely disappear. Here's an example from Bjorn Nordstrom. This is an article in Discovery magazine, but it's also in Discover magazine, sorry. This is also based on a book he published in 1983. He was known as the Electric Man. I have the title for the book. You can also download that. He said, all living systems contain numerous functioning electrical circuits. These circuits exist in all body functions and determine the well-being of the body. Has anybody heard that today from their medical school system? I work with medical students every day. I also work with engineering students. My students do learn about these things, but these aren't things that they will learn in their regular curriculum. Well, Bjorn Nordstrom was an interesting guy. He's most well known for just inventing the biopsy needle. It was he who was the one that was ridiculed for many years, saying no one would ever use a biopsy. That's ridiculous. Well, think of how a biopsy needle is used today. Well, He was ridiculed even more so when he had these ideas of using electricity to heal the body, and he did clinical trials looking at cancer and many other things. He also was the chairman of the board of the Nobel laureates in choosing the Nobel Prize winner. So he is extremely, his reputation, despite his controversial research, was well recognized as a pioneer in multiple fields. So that's only the reason why I brought up his name. Here's another one just to give more examples. Dinshah Ghadiali, again, 100 years ago, he was kind of a student prodigy from India. He was brilliant by the time he got out of his teenage years. He taught thousands of students of how to use light therapy for healing. I won't go into too much detail. Anybody can look into it. A short version, he worked with some of the top medical doctors in this country, surgeons that saw remarkable effects of exposing light to wounds to accelerate the healing process. Some of the most reputable surgeons. He was hounded from the minute he proposed this type of research, because if light could be used for healing and treatment, it was not consistent with the pharmaceutical model that we had in this time by the 1930s and 1940s and into the 1950s. And each of these people I put up have their own history to them and biography and body of literature that either supports or describes the kind of things that they were working on, and that's one of the devices.
Can I interrupt for a second?
Yes, please.
My name's Pat. I'm over here. I don't have my iPad's not
I see you.
labeled. But I think everyone should, if you're interested in some of these things that you're putting on the screen, if these people are interested, I think we should take screenshots of it, because it's great. It's an easy way to take notes, and the lecture is starting excellently. So I just thought of that.
So yeah, so thank you, and I will provide my slides. Any of the slides I present will be available at the end, so don't worry about that. Okay.
Oh, great. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and again, I'm only showing a snapshot. I would really like to go into more detail on some of these and more people, but because I want to get to more of the microwaves, I'm kind of going through it faster than I need.
Okay, I'm just going to mute my mic then. Thank you very much.
Okay, sure. So one of the last people I want to mention here that also has tremendous reputation is Robert Becker, MD, an orthopedic surgeon nominated twice for the Nobel Prize. He's famous for the book, The Body Electric. I highly recommend that for anybody that wants to understand how the body uses electricity, at least this in the 1960s and 1970s version. We've learned so much more since then. But so few people are familiar with his work, even though he was funded by NIH, he was funded by the Navy, he published in Nature, he published in Science, and yet today we don't even know that he was the first person to demonstrate complete tissue regeneration of a limb using electricity. How many people even knew that that was possible? Well, people had tried for hundreds of years using 2 animal models to demonstrate this. Some of you may be familiar with the salamander, which has incredible ability to regenerate its tissue. You can take out its eyeball and its eyeball will grow back. You could take out 1/3 of the salamander's brain and its brain will regrow and it'll be functional. That's the beauty of the salamander and the ability to regenerate. And organisms that are even more primitive, many of the sea creatures can do this. He talks about that in The Body Electric in the beginning. Well, it turns out you go one step up in the species chain, go to the frog, okay, go salamander to frog, you amputate the frog's limb, the frog grows a stump. People have known that for 100 years. And people had tried all kinds of things to get the limb on the frog to regrow. Well, he did a series of remarkable experiments and showed that by monitoring the electrical signals at the stump, and learning what the salamander was doing or what the body was doing, and apply those same principles to the frog and apply electricity to the limb at just the right way at the right time, he was able to reproducibly regrow those limbs. And that work, I believe, was published in Nature at the time. This is back in the 1960s. So that's an only one example. He was interested in bone regeneration and regrowth. He took those principles to mammals and rats and showed that you can use those principles to regrow more tissue in mammals. He took it to humans. The human system is more complicated than the frog, so he wasn't completely able to do everything like he could do in a frog, but he did think if we understood the signaling properly and could get funding and research to continue that, he was confident that that was entirely possible. But I'm leaving here with the quote here: "We are now in the process of revising the past century's biochemical concept under which all major life processes are chemical in nature to one that proposes that such processes are electromagnetic in nature." I'm also putting up there cross currents, which I have here, and I put it up there. This may be even more relevant to this presentation because half of this book, as the title indicates, half of it is devoted to the perils of electropollution. And yes, that includes microwave radiation, as well as power line noise and other types of electricity, which have proven to be harmful to your health. And he talks about it in this book, which was published in 1990. Okay, much of the research he did was in the 60s and 70s. He was on the boards of all the safety panels, so he knew what the conversations were and the discussions. And half of this book is also devoted to the promise of electromedicine. What types of electricity and magnetism is actually helpful to the body, helpful in healing, and helpful as therapy. So highly recommended, even though it's a 1990s version. I will say, one of the reasons he wrote these books is because in the 1976, 1977, you can find the episode of 60 Minutes. He was interviewed in part of a multi-part episode on 60 Minutes looking at a power line, specifically safety in terms of power lines. At that time, they were building much larger, higher amplitude power lines from New York to other locations. And he did give a few comments saying that the evidence was clear that you don't want to live near a power line, that these types of fields are harmful, something to that effect. And after that appearance on 60 Minutes, he saw his funding from NIH pulled, he saw his funding from the Navy pulled, and he was a professor at Syracuse, and so he pivoted and started writing these books and describing his experience. So there's just one guy out of many I could be pulling from to look at how important it is for us to start looking at electricity and break down dogmas of how most of the medical community is looking at the body, because they're based on broken and invalidated models. In the worst case, they're simplistic, and the best case, they're simplistic. The worst case is they're just invalid and inappropriate to understand how the body becomes sick and heals. I'm going to give you just a couple other quick examples on different scales. A lot of people in the medical establishment will be told in medical school, for example, white blood cells, I'll use that term, use enzymes to kill the microbes. Those are your scavenger cells that go around, and I could show videos of this, but they go around, they look for foreign material or material that shouldn't be there, and it cleans it up, it eats it, phagocytose, whatever you want to call it. It's described in the literature that it uses enzymes to do that. Well, it turns out white cells actually use sparks of electricity first. They shoot out pulses of electricity, that releases the enzyme, but it's the electricity that shocks, well, together initiates the chemical release that starts this process. This is a French paper back in 1998 that describes they were directly able to measure these electrical pulses. So yes, chemistry and electricity are related, but the chemical model can always be defined using an electromagnetic model. It's a subset. Chemistry is a language, not necessarily a science. And I'm happy to argue with people on this point, but it is a language, much more than it is a science. Okay. Here's another example from another paper showing, and there's several examples of this in the literature, disabling viruses with weak direct current electricity, in this case HIV, and I point you to a paper here where it did controlled experiments. I'm also showing down below using other types of similar weak electrical pulses to disable herpes simplex virus, the adenovirus. This is from 2011. They also did clinical trials using these principles at Albert Einstein Medical School. I believe that's my article at the top there. Yeah, Albert Einstein School of Medicine, 1999. It was reported in the public literature, the popular newspaper, like in that article, that there was quite a bit of success. They were unable to really peer review publish any of the results of that clinical study, but people were involved, saw some remarkable effects of disabling, not killing, but simply disabling it, making the HIV virus inactive using pulses of electricity. And some of these things are just to kind of pique your interest. I can't go into much detail of how these things work. But again, another example of weak currents. These are very small microcurrents here. Can stimulate ATP production and amino acid production. And here's a paper from 1982 describing that. Higher currents can actually reduce ATP production. ATP is in your mitochondria. That's your energy. It produces the energy for your cell. So you can actually increase or decrease the amount of energy your cell has available by using microcurrents or currents themselves. Just examples of how rich this field is and how much control you have of creating different effects on the body. I'll just mention, even as you recall, I did say there's all these different components of an electrical wave. There's a whole nother part of the variability, and that's the biological variability, that each of us are different. We may all respond a little bit different. That's inherent in any biological system. We have to keep that in mind. So you do this to 3 people over here, they may look the same, they may be the same age, same race, whatever, and you do it in 3 other people, you may not see exactly the same effect, or you might not see any effect at all. So you got to put everything together to really have a good understanding of what is going on or what is happening. All right, so before I transition into kind of the second part of what I want to talk about, I wanted to show an example that is actually common. You can find this in people that have been exposed with microwaves, a condition on the left there where red blood cells stick together. Here I'm calling it agglutinated blood with fibrin. You can see the image there of red blood cells sticking together. It's also an expression called Rouleau syndrome, very well established. There are many things that can cause this, including microwave radiation can create that effect. But this is actually just simply 2 patents that show pulses of electricity, weak pulses, if applied to your blood vessels for a period of time, or in the dish. You could do this in the dish, or you could do this actually in vivo and see this effect. Will clean up your blood so they look nice and spherical and separated. And that's supposed to be an indicator of clean blood and better health when you can stay in the condition there on the right and the left. And here are just 2 patents related to devices that are able to do that. The devices here that are described, back in the day, you could probably spend a couple bucks at Radio Shack and build these devices. These are not highly profitable devices. Even with the patents behind them, you're not going to make billions of dollars with these type of devices, okay? So that's going to be one of the deterrents why we may not all be so familiar with some of these things, because they're not necessarily big money makers. All right, just to amplify this a bit, even though the medical establishment as we know it may be focused on molecular biology, certainly since World War II or 1950s and 1960s, much less on biophysics, which would include electricity and magnetism, you can be assured that the Department of Defense and military aspects we know have always been very interested in the biophysical aspects and the role of electricity on the body from long before World War II, actually. So here's an example from a DoD project that shows, the idea here is you can put someone inside this barrel, and there's somebody over here that can tune a bunch of dials and create different electromagnetic fields inside that barrel while the person's there. The idea here is if this person is sick or disease in some way, they can put the right signatures in there and get that person to recover. Of course, what those signatures are, that requires some research or looking at history or looking at, or maybe some of that's classified, but this is the concept that was being pursued has been being pursued as a long time. At the same time, you have to wonder, well, if you can restore good health with these sorts of devices, is it possible to use these devices as a weapon if you're using the wrong signatures or bad signatures and injecting those into people? Those are obvious questions that anybody should be asking. Now, this image itself is from 1999. I have a reference there, but it's actually from the DoD project. And from that same project, here's another depiction. The idea would be, you could have a portable system based on the same principle. There's a little box there, depending on what type of fields it puts. You have a little device you touch the body with, it could create those signatures, okay? So this is a vast, enormous field, very little exploration at the universities, almost not heard of at medical schools or physicians. They're not trained in this. So they're not going to be experts in this unless they've done their own independent research or they've been exposed to this in other ways. And I'm including university professors. They're very few people in biomedical engineering. You're not going to be taking classes on how electricity in this way would affect the body. You might take a class on how to heat the body, ablation, how to focus an ultrasound beam or focus a microwave beam or whatever to heat the body. You might get some background on that. Very not typical. Maybe a graduate class may be offered at some universities. It's just not the kind of information you're going to get. So you can't expect students or professors at the university to know much about this. I do believe more people in the military will be familiar with this, but if they get too far into this technology, it may very well be classified, which will prevent them to really openly talk about it. The good thing is that there's huge bodies of literature openly available to anybody who wants to look. And in some cases, if you're not a professor at the university, you got a better chance to have an open mind to go in and do your own research if you're pointed in the right direction and you can understand some basic language and concepts. You can develop that knowledge base fairly easily without getting into all the innuendo. All right. So my final thoughts on this half of the talk is there's plenty of literature on this. So for healing, for looking at the promise of electromedicine, there are many, many things out there by reputable people. All you have to do is look at there's things that describe physical mechanisms, the biological mechanisms, the healing effects. I'm showing 4 examples up here. Vibrational medicine by Richard Gerber, MD, that's often considered a Bible. It's old now, but you can learn a tremendous amount how vibration affects the body. That could be sound, it could be light, electricity. Jerry Tennant is a well-known medical doctor in Dallas. He has a clinic. He's published a book called Healing is Voltage. He also has devices. Very interesting understanding of how electricity is used for disease and healing. James Oshman is a PhD, energy medicine, the scientific basis. Again, very good explanation of how things operate on the cell level, the organ level, the organism level. And then finally, I've got one energy medicine from Norman Shealy, who is a pioneer in neurosurgery. He's been around a long time. He's got an MD PhD. He's been working in this field for decades. Why most of us have not heard of this, we can only guess, but that needs to change, especially if we're going to start talking about the effects of microwave radiation, okay? So as I transition into the other topic, which most of you are here on the call for, and you'll see why that's relevant, is I want to just take you back to a day when it was perfectly fine for us to advertise for smoking. So on the left, you see from Stanford University, a photo of 3 children. They look like maybe 3, 4, 5 years old max, smoking cigarettes as part of an ad campaign. And as you may very well know, it's been known for decades, many of evidence, that smoking is dangerous to our health. But it didn't take until really the 1990s until it was really considered an established science that smoking causes cancer, which isn't exactly true. It's a causal factor of cancer. Not everybody that smokes is going to get cancer, so it's a little misleading, but at least we think the concept that smoking causes cancer is kind of accepted today because it wasn't so much established in the scientific community, it was established in the court system, I believe. And that's why we use that terminology now, because in the scientific community, it's been out there for decades and decades that we had the top scientists in the world in the 50s and 60s saying all the science is there, we need to slow down on the smoking because it's bad for your health, okay? Well, how does that relate to today? We see ads with children and babies using electronic devices all the time. And the reason that the advertising agencies want to use children and mothers in particular in their advertising campaign is because when that technology is brought to the family, it gives great credibility to the product and the safety of that product. And it reaches everybody across the community in terms of accepting a technology. They understand that they need to show technology in the hands of children and mothers in particular for the technology to be widely accepted. So that's simply a tactic. Of course, we need to be aware of it, but the whole question is it safe and what's the data for that? Well, when it comes to microwaves, there's nothing new here. In some cases, this goes back maybe before smoking. Some people would say the 1800s. I'm not going to go quite back that far, but I will take you back to the 1960s, debating the microwave danger. Alan Frey on the left, I will show a publication from him from 1961, showing how you can hear low-level microwave pulses. This has been known actually since the 1930s, but he did quite a bit of research looking at microwaves. And he debated Herman Schwan there. And if I'll just read, so underneath it says, debating the microwave danger. Some scientists believe that the threat is small. Others, including the Russians, believe it may be grave. Do they know something we don't? Okay. And then on the right, it says Alan Frey, who is actually an American, I believe, but Alan Frey, like the Russians, has probed the effect of microwave radiation on animal organs. Herman Schwan's research typifies the major American trend of looking for microwaves thermal effects, meaning effects of heating. And then it says, debating the microwave danger. Some scientists believe the threat is small, others including, okay, so that's what I read before. And this was from, actually, this picture was from the 60s, featured in this book, The Microwave Debate, which was published in 1984. It's hard to find this book, but if there's any one reference where you want to really look at the microwave debate, this is a great book. Tremendous detail about some of the history, 1984 and before. I want to just add, who was Herman Schwan? Well, some say he was the father of bioengineering. And he did some pioneering work at looking at how the electricity affects the body. But he also worked at the Max Planck Institute in Germany during World War II. And he was very much involved with Nazi scientists at that time. And he came over to the United States on Operation Paperclip, one of many, many scientists. If you're not familiar with Operation Paperclip, it's important to research that and learn about that. Officially, the US government says roughly 500 to 1,000 Nazi scientists came to the United States. Often took different names and continued to do their research here. Some of them were convicted of Nazi crimes. Herman Schwan was someone that continued to do research in this area in terms of using electricity and magnetism. And he is very much one of the most influential people in producing the current guidelines that we have today to microwave radiation. So when you look at the history in the 60s and 50s and debates, he was a tremendously important figure, even though his own research showed that it wasn't just about heat. His own research and his own paper showed you could get multiple different effects from microwave radiation that could affect the body. And he even admitted that. So in some cases, this is not fair to him that it was just heating that he was looking at. So how can this be? How can there be such a rich field, but so few experts out there that really out there to talk about it? Well, that takes us to the elephant and the six blind scientists. If you, in this day and age, if you're a medical doctor, you very early on will have to choose a specialization. Maybe it'll be the brain, maybe it'll be the heart, maybe it'll be the lungs, the respiratory system. Whatever it is, you will have to make a choice and you will focus on that, and that will be your life. Okay, you will be an expert in that organ. But as you see, if you did that with the elephant, as these scientists are desperately trying to figure out what it is, you are never going to figure out it's an elephant. In fact, everybody is going to conclude that whatever they're looking at is the whole thing and is the most important thing there. It doesn't matter what those scientists are going to do, unless they can back up, put down their dogma and think of things differently, they are never going to see an elephant there. And unfortunately, this is the university, the typical normal professor. They got to get funding in their area. They got to think that. they are not in any position to unlearn things that they learned at the university that might not have been completely accurate. They have to accept those and they have to live with those, and that's how they survive, okay? So we have to pay attention to the few people that are able to back up and look at the whole picture. And that's looking whether it's at an elephant or the body or the cell. We have to look at the bigger picture and always keep that in mind. So going back to the electromagnetic spectrum, again, we're talking about microwave radiation, which is defined in physical terms from 0.3 gigahertz to 300 gigahertz. And you'll notice that all wireless microwave technology that we use today, that's Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, cell phones, cell phone transmitters, 5G, 4G, whatever terms you want to use, it is all microwave radiation. So when you talk about these devices, that is really the point you want to always remember and hit. They are all using microwave radiation, and more specifically, they're using pulsed microwave radiation, which turns out to be worse to our health than just continuous without pulsing radiation, okay? So industry has created these terms out of thin air, 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, and they don't have a specific definition. It changes depending on who you ask, and they may pivot this way and they may pivot that way. It may include 70 gigahertz, it may include whatever it is. That's the beauty of lingo and terminology, and you have to understand that, yes, the public understands something, 4G, oh yeah, something to do with my phone, and 5G is something great, yeah, and they may know it has something to do with the Internet of Things, they may have something to do with artificial intelligence, whatever it is. Remember, the energy it's using is microwave radiation, and that's what's going to be relevant when we look at the literature. Let's be pragmatic and honest here, okay? First of all, a cell phone company has certain pulse sequences they may use to communicate with your device. With 4G, they may have another pulse sequence with 5G. Those pulse sequences are often or usually proprietary. They're patented. We don't know what they are. Okay, so how do we do a safety study when we don't even have access to what the pulses are, right? Okay, that's a problem, right? Well, there's also an infinite number of possible combinations of pulsing you can do. So even if we knew what they were exactly, it would be very difficult to even do a safety study with exact. So there's all kinds of problems to even ask the question, how do you test something that industry is doing? Well, that can be left by itself. The key there is that none of those pulses, if we knew them or not, have not been specifically tested for safety. So the assumption that they're safe would be an incorrect assumption because they are not. So let's back off a little bit. Now let's look at the general literature of what we know as a whole body when we talk about energy between 0.3 and 300 gigahertz, because all is fair game. And as we'll find out, legally, the court system uses terms, the Supreme Court specifically uses terms relevant and reliable when submitting evidence. That's from the Daubert 1994. That's why this is important. So what does that mean? Reliable simply means that peer-reviewed literature will be given the most weight, okay? And it turns out the courts believe that more recent literature will be given more weight than older literature, but it all helps, okay? Reliable or relevant refers to similar type of energy in this case, published literature that uses this energy in a similar way to look at health effects, okay? So that's real. So if I told you I was using 60 hertz power line noise to do a safety study and I tried to relate it to 4G and 5G, it wouldn't be relevant, okay? So that's really, really important. So when I get into now, let's look at effects of microwave radiation, and there's endless numbers of studies we can do. As you will see, I will bring some examples and where to look, but this is totally relevant to the question, are there harmful effects of microwave radiation? What type of effects are harmful? How consistent are those fields with fields that we may be exposed to today? And in my opinion, the burden should be on industry to demonstrate that it's safe. So if things are a little inconclusive, sorry, industry, you're going to need to step up and you need to demonstrate safety. I don't believe that's possible because there is so much evidence to the contrary, but that's what would have to be required if you want to show that these fields are going to be safe. Okay. So when we talk about 4G and 5G, as I said, there's all these different devices. And I want to note, when we do refer to 5G, that actually includes 4G. So nothing is necessarily being removed. When you get 5G technology as it's being rolled in, you are actually adding to the existing infrastructure. You're not necessarily replacing anything. 5G includes all those devices that we use today, but we're adding new stuff. So you can see all those things up there as examples. All of those devices there are using microwave radiation at different frequencies, intensities, and other parameters. But is microwave radiation even natural? Okay, this is from Robert Becker's book, Cross Currents. On the left, we're actually looking at natural electromagnetic fields from the environment. So if you had stuck up some kind of meter, let's say in the year 1900, maybe 1850, these are the only fields you really would have been able to detect at any measurable level. You have visible light, as we know, because we can see light. That's always been here on the planet. You also have the Earth's magnetic field on the left side there. Yeah, that's true. And the real only other source of any magnitude is lightning, which can produce a tiny amount of microwave radiation as well as a lot of other fields. That is the natural Earth's exposure to electromagnetic fields, okay? So what has happened in more recent days, now this is from 1990, you can see on the right, all those frequencies that used to be non-existent, really, at any measurable level, are now completely filled in from the normal magnetic field, which is steady in DC, all the way out to visible light and beyond. And you can see that the radio frequencies, AM, FM, military, extremely low frequencies, TV, microwaves, we filled in that whole spectrum in recent years, okay? Now, does that mean it's good or bad? It doesn't necessarily mean it's good or bad. It just means it's not natural in terms of the rest of our existence. We haven't had those fields present. But let's look at it one more way. In the bottom axis, we are looking at frequencies again, going from kilohertz DC down to terahertz. But those different colors are looking at different periods of time. So in the 1920s, the green was the natural background. We just started, we certainly had electricity and certain things showing up. So that's not what wouldn't be equivalent to 1850, but it's a starting point. But look at how microwaves have increased over from the 1920s, 1950s, 1980s until 2010. And the important thing to note is that these are factors of 10. Each of these grid lines, as you're going up, are factors of 10 in magnitude. So if I were to compare, actually, I'm sorry, each of these grid lines are factors of 1,000 in magnitude. So if I took the level of your gigahertz, 1 to 2 gigahertz, where your cell phone is, here in 2010, and I compared it to the green, we are looking at 18 orders of magnitude difference. 18 orders. So I don't have even, I can't even put a number on that. It's okay, if we had an atom and we multiplied that 18 orders of magnitude, we would be on the scale of, I don't know, the solar system. I don't even know, maybe bigger than that. So think about that now. Is that good or bad? We don't know yet. Let's look at some data. These are the kind of devices that you might see somebody sitting down and using there, and you can measure exposures. This is a particular very recent article from IEEE, a group of engineers that if you read that article, conclude the answer to that sentence there at the end, how safe are we? They would say, well, maybe not that safe. You read that article and read the conclusions. But this is from an engineering perspective of how you might measure some of these devices. It's hard to measure all those things that I measured earlier on, so maybe we need to focus on a couple things. Well, we know the frequencies are somewhat limited. We're talking microwaves, but we can certainly look at intensity or amplitude. So let's start to see how the traditional methods are being used to evaluate or determine exposure limits. Okay, so now we're going to get into what are the limits of these devices. Now I can only look at one thing at a time. In this case, I'm looking at power or power density. Okay, that's related to the amplitude of the signal. As I told you, there's many other things to consider, but this is a good one. Let's just start with amplitude. And I'm comparing by countries. Okay, you'll notice that this blue line here includes really 3 countries in the whole world. That is United States, Canada, and England. They've decided to set the limit currently at 1,000 microwatts per centimeter squared. That's the same as 1 milliwatt per centimeter squared. That is the upper limit for your cell phone for one of the parameters that we talked about. That turns out to be 200 or 100 times higher than the maximum limit in Russia, China, and Italy, for example. Well, why is that? Well, they have a different perception on what is harm and what is not. That could be one interpretation. Okay, Israel and India have 1/10 the value. If you go to Switzerland, they're 1,000 times less their maximum exposure that can be generated from their wireless devices for exposure. Okay, Austria is 1/10,000th of that. So, is there some reason somebody working at the desk in Austria has a different risk associated with them than someone sitting in my office here? If this isn't an opinion. Okay, where do the opinions come from? Is the public involved in those opinions? All right, that is just looking at this guideline. So let's look a little bit more careful where that comes from. Well, the key thing to remember is that that upper limit there is related to heating effects only. So in the United States, and assumingly in these other countries, the United States, Canada, and Britain, if you're not heating the tissue enough over like 5 minutes, you aren't causing any damage. Don't talk to me about it. I don't care. It doesn't exist. If you're not raising the temperature, specifically 1 degree temperature based on their like models of their device, you are perfectly safe. And that's pretty much the end of the story. Now, there is technically another version, but that really doesn't come into play in any devices. So I'm just going to stick to that. But that's actually the interpretation of why we have that limit today. But let's just stick to that upper limit. And how many people there that are listening actually know that in the manual, and I'm going to pick the manual of a couple devices, but in the manual of your phone, it says you are not supposed to put the phone against your body, ever. Why? Because it will exceed their power limit. It could exceed based on this. You're not supposed to do it, okay? Now, there's a reason for that. The way that the telephone companies are allowed to test the device, they have a certain distance between the device and the sensor, and all they have to do is make sure that their device does not exceed that limit that I show over here, and then everything is fine. But if you don't maintain that distance with that device in your body, it can, and in fact will, exceed the limit. How many people know that? Well, in Berkeley, about 5 years, 6, 7 years ago, whatever, maybe 5 years ago, they found out about this as we want to warn our customers at point of sale about this. People need to know this. It's in your manual in your phone. Anybody can go on the phone. I'm showing iPhone 7. It doesn't matter what phone you have, you will see a similar number. It may not be 5 millimeters. If you got an old BlackBerry, it'll say 25 millimeter separation. You need to keep it an inch away from your body, but it's somewhere in between those. It's in your manual. It's tiny. You got to zoom in on it. You'll find it, okay? But Berkeley said that's not good enough. We need to inform people when they buy their phone that this is dangerous. They need to know that this could be harmful, okay? So they passed a law, and the telephone companies said, well, no, Berkeley, you can't do that. We're going to sue you. You can't just be putting labels on your boxes like that. Well, earlier this year, the Supreme Court ruled that Berkeley had every right to put that warning on their boxes and warn their customers, and I believe they're either doing that or they're in the process of doing that now. And it turns out 12 other states can pass a similar law, my understanding. I know Arizona is one. I don't know about Pennsylvania. But just based on that one ruling, other states, if they so choose, could pass that law. Just to add a little bit more to that, how many people watching knew that the manual for your laptop tells you to never keep your laptop closer than 20 centimeters from your body. It doesn't sound like so much like a laptop anymore, does it? So maybe their advertising campaign isn't as accurate as it may seem. So yes, it does say that in your manual, and yes, you can and will exceed exposure limits. And the blue and the red here show that clearly. So this is a measurement that was taken. I believe this is in 2010 in Time magazine, but oh, sorry, this was measured by the French National Agency, Frequency Agency, June 1st, 2007. They measured exposure from the phone with a separation, as it says in the manual, versus when you place it against your body. And you can see that there's dramatic increase, and these red bars actually exceed the safety limit. So there you're seeing what I said before. And the reason is when you touch the devices with your body, instead of having air in between, you're actually coupling the microwaves much better into your body. It's a coupling of the microwave directly into your skin, into your body. So there's the reason for it. But how many people know that? Well, that's a problem. All right. How do they determine these things? Well, they use models. So I'm showing the head model here on the left, the current safety, the current exposure guidelines I mentioned earlier are based on using this head model, which was a 220-pound male, a big skull that they put a probe inside. It was a model of a skull, a dummy, and they measured the fields. And as long as the fields didn't increase to a certain level, they said that's safe, okay? That's how they determine those numbers, and they do the models, and they put some numbers together, and that's what they get, okay? They do something similar with a laptop. They can measure, use these. We use these for some of the experiments that we do as well. But let's make that clear. There is no distinction between a 220-pound male and a 2-year-old baby using an electronic device. The exposure limits are the same. The guidelines, there's no difference in the guidelines as published. It turns out that children and babies are much more vulnerable to these fields because their skulls are so thin. The bone around their bone marrow is thin. The blood is more susceptible. And here's a model showing how a phone can penetrate from one side of the body to the other in a child, a 5-year-old child, whereas an adult, it will be confined to mostly one side near the phone. So very important. So if there are effects, it's going to be amplified in a child. I hope that matters to the parents out there. All of this information is readily available, and people need to know these things. So who sets those guidelines? Those guidelines I was showing earlier, the 1,000 microwatts per centimeter squared. Well, in this country, the Federal Communications FCC Commission, Federal Communications Commission, FCC, they have the power to set the exposure limits. They do not claim there are safety limits. They don't say that. It's not said anywhere. These are guidelines for telecom companies to use when setting their devices. They want them to stay within those guidelines. That's it, okay? Well, the FCC for a long time has been what Harvard ethics professor at Harvard, the ethics department wrote this book a few years ago called The Captured Agency, which essentially is just saying that the FCC now for long has just been pushing the agenda of industry. We know who runs the agencies these days. Extremely important that they are the ones responsible for setting guidelines. Note, they're not even, the FCC is mainly engineers. They don't even have a background or expertise necessarily in biology and biological systems and health, bioeffects. They're not qualified to really talk about safety. So why go to them with conversations about safety? In fact, they have to go to the health department if they want questions on safety. The health department, as we'll see, actually goes to typically the National Toxicology Program because they're the gold standard. So if anybody wants to talk about safety, they got to go through all these other people and ask for help, okay? But those other agencies aren't directly involved. FDA is not involved directly, okay? So now let's get into health effects for the last 15 minutes here, 20 minutes maybe. The first thing I'm going to say is there's well over 10,000 peer-reviewed and government studies that address the question of microwave radiation and health effects. The vast majority of them show positive results. So let's make this perfectly clear, okay? So there's probably more science in this area than looking at any other environmental factor in the history of science. Any drug, smoking, there isn't that many publications when it talks about looking at electromagnetic fields and microwaves specifically. There is a huge body of literature. So the best I can do is give you some examples of where to go and what to look for and get the gist of what's out there and ask questions. Is it safe, or how safe is it, or under what conditions is it safe or not safe, and what type of things can happen when someone or something is exposed to microwave radiation. So here's one paper, and I'm just presenting the conclusions, and this is from the US Navy in 1972. Anybody can download this. It actually has a bibliography of 2,300 papers, 1972. And as you go through the conclusions of some of those 2,300 studies, you will realize that on the right, and all of the things I'm showing on the right is a direct result of this one publication that has a bibliography of 2,300 papers. Symptoms of exposure to radio-frequency radiation, okay? Brain, I'm listing all kinds of stuff. We'll go into a little more detail, but pretty much anything you can think of. When the first radar transmitters went up in 1932 or so, the first thing people were complaining of, migraines, fatigue, sleeplessness, nausea, hearing. They could hear clicking, no one could figure it out. Well, that was settled years later. They understood how that worked. That's just the brain. Heart, arrhythmias, eyes, cataracts, that's been known for almost 100 years, very reproducible. The few studies that show negative results, meaning low-level microwaves within the limits that I just showed you earlier, you could create cataracts in a human eye, you can create cataracts in a rabbit eye. The only papers that really have shown negative results are ones that did not follow the protocol, did not wait long enough to see the cataracts develop. So when you look at the literature, you can find these things and patterns. Say, did they do what these people did? Oh no, they stopped it a month earlier. Oops, well, they didn't see the result. So you can go in that deeply, but it's important to get the gist here of what I'm talking about. Immense amount of literature. Every aspect of the biological system can be impacted by microwave radiation. Just as another example, let's stick to the 1970s. In the 1970s, the World Health Organization organized a conference of the top 60 scientists in the world in this area, and they all came together in Warsaw, Poland, to share their work and their studies in this area. You can find the book online still called The Biological Effects of Health Hazards of Microwave Radiation. You can also find this on the web. Olga Sheehan, I believe, has a website where she talks about this conference in particular. She's a former UN member. And here on the right, I'm just showing a selection of a 350-page document describing thermal and non-thermal effects of, as the title indicates. You can go up in the occupational workplace, home. You can, again, find almost anything you want. I'll just read these. There's a whole session. B, influence of microwave radiation on the nervous system and behavior. Psychogenic stressors are potent mediators of the thermal response to microwave radiation. Session E was focusing on occupational exposure and public health aspects of microwave radiation. Neurologic findings in persons exposed to microwaves, a study in the health status of microwave workers, selected cases of microwave cataract in man associated with concomitant annotated pathologies, retinal changes in microwave workers, assessment of lens translucency, how clear it was in juveniles, microwave workers, and age match groups. Just a selection of how much literature was already available by the 1973 conference, okay? So are we being misled today when people are not familiar with these studies, when they're not reciting the work from these studies? It's not even part of their vocabulary. Did we just forget about them? This is the conclusion of that conference, one of them, B, part B, and I'll read that. 1973. In addition to their heating effect of tissues, microwaves interact with the electric dipole moment of biologic molecules. These interactions may be observed and interpreted in terms of the shape and size of the macromolecules and the nature of the structure of the water in the neighboring environment. Such parameters may be correlated with the incidence and treatment of certain diseases with which the molecules in question are associated. In this way, it would be possible to find a direct link between a clinical condition and a structural abnormality at a molecular level, changing the structure of molecules with microwaves. As, for example, has been done in the case of sickle cell anemia and in hemoglobin. So if those of you familiar with sickle cell anemia, you get red blood cells that have changed their shape. They look like sickles. And for that reason, they no longer function properly. That's in sickle cell anemia. Well, what else might happen when you change the structure and form of the molecules in your body? Just a mechanism, one mechanism. I think the last main periodical publication I'd like to highlight, this one's from the Ford Foundation from 1965, called The Effect of Microwaves on the Central Nervous System. This is a pretty large document, and I'm just showing there the table of contents. This is all devoted to the central nervous system and effects. And you can go down the list there: influence on sleep, influence on motor and sensory nerves, and you can go down the list and you can get more detail. Published and funded by the Ford Foundation, 1965. So since there's really over 15,000 papers, here I'm just showing on one slide some of my favorite ones that I can't go into much detail, but to show you that every branch of the government has published their own versions of what I've talked about long time ago as well as recently. So the top two are from the Army. I got a couple from the Navy. The Air Force is listed there. A couple from NASA. Some of my favorites. That first, that first one from NASA. Influence of microwave radiation on the organism of man and animals. That's a really good one. 229 pages. CIA, a couple there are listed from CIA. One was recently declassified, specifically covering 5G. So 5G we already talked about. That includes 4G, but 5G also gets us to higher frequencies, which are millimeter waves, smaller waves. That paper there in 1977, very recently declassified by the CIA, is called Biological Effects of Millimeter Radio Waves. So I would recommend giving that one a look. It is the CIA after all. Hey, there's the EPA. They had something to say in 1984. 278 pages, biological effects of radio frequency radiation, including mechanisms. I highly recommend that one. After that publication, the EPA, their microwave, the electromagnetic program there was defunded, and most of the people left shortly after that, and they've never recovered in terms of having expertise at the EPA in this area. And that's most unfortunate, but their publication lives on, so we can still learn from their observations and their studies. So now we get to more recent times. We've got NIH last year completing really a 15-year study. So this is it's important to understand how this NIH-funded study came about. So 1999, everybody's concerned about cell phones, safety, danger. And so the FCC says, hey, we're not qualified to deal with this. So they go to essentially NIH and say, can you please set up a study to look at the effects of cell phones, radiation safety, to put to sleep all these rumors and conspiracy theories that cell phones are dangerous? Can you at least set up a study, do it properly so we can get the result? So the NIH says, okay, well, we'll turn to the National Toxicology Program, the NTP. They are the gold standard for looking at any environmental factor. And so they put together an elaborate $30 million study, and it ended up taking 10 to 15 years. It really was not published till 2018, the first publications. And guess what they found? Well, in their words, they found clear evidence of cancer. In fact, 9 different types of cancer using cell phone radiation exposure, the first one there. And this, again, is the largest study ever. And they did the studies in both mice and rats. And they had multiple centers, multiple groups involved in this. It was a complicated, long-term study to look at this. Well, and they also published earlier this year that it turns out from that same study, you can also cause DNA damage. That's genotoxicity from cell phone radiation exposure. But they're not the first ones to report that. In fact, there are quite a few publications that have reported that. They've just confirmed what many other people have already published. But that is very much a gold standard. It's been mostly ignored, especially by the FDA and certainly the media, because that's a fairly recent one. I will add that the Ramazzini Institute in Italy did their own very similar study, and they're the largest agency in Italy. They found almost the same results. That was also published in 2018. So there's plenty of stuff out there. How much does it take to convince someone that these fields are not just for our benefit and our good health? How much does it really take? So this figure is just simply showing all the different effects that have been published that are all below our current standard of the 1,000 microwatts per centimeter squared in this country. That's this line up here. And as you go down one order of magnitude at a time, you're decreasing the amount of exposure. But even tremendous small amounts of microwaves has been shown to alter an EEG waveform, a brain signal, an electrical brain signal. So your body is extremely sensitive. Even if you don't know about it, things can happen in your body that are occurring. Doesn't mean it's bad. It just means that it's sensitive to it. That's what this says. Now, other people have proposed other safety levels. The Bioinitiative, if those of you are familiar with that, a few years ago came out and said this red line, based on all the literature we looked at, if we had to set a safety level, it might be down here. Now, this is several orders of magnitude less of where we are today. So, of course it would be better, but it's not even clear that that is completely safe. But I wish we had something closer to that to protect people today, okay? This again is just showing, also published, reproduced in 2013, but was published in 2002. Distance from a cell phone tower and people experiencing these symptoms. You can see there's 16 different symptoms from fatigue, sleeplessness, dizziness, nausea, and the distance they are from the towers. And you can see very high correlation, at least. If you live near a tower, you're simply more likely to feel these symptoms. I think if you're living near a tower, you should have a right to know this, okay? You should have access to this information. If we had a real media reporting, they would be telling us about this, but we don't, so we have to learn this ourselves and tell each other about these types of studies so we can at least be thinking about them and maybe acting. Oh, well, so that takes us to the wireless industry. Well, in the 1990s, as I mentioned, a lot of people had concerns about cell phones, and they decided, the wireless industry, we needed certain talking points to make sure that our employees and the people, if they were being interviewed by the media, they had certain points that they would hit, and to make sure that there wasn't anything, the wrong things being said. So let's have a look. And by the way, this same playbook, my understanding, is very much still used today. So very much relevant today, what was used back then. And you can find these things online, by the way. So let's look at a few of these questions. Well, one question, how do you respond to talk of a possible link between cellular phones and cancer? Well, you just simply say there's no research involving human beings or research animals that indicates cellular telephone use is a cancer initiator or promoter. In fact, no research has shown that electromagnetic emissions characteristic of those of cellular telephones cause any adverse health effects. Now, with all that mumbo jumbo, whether or not they're being very clever with the terminology or blatantly misleading people, I don't know. But the point is, these are playbooks. They don't want people going off in the wrong direction when they're being interviewed. Other questions, can you cite any studies indicating that cellular phones are safe? They say the FDA, EPA, and SAG are closely monitoring this issue. Did they mention the 1984 study by the EPA? No. Well, anyway, you guys can go through the playbook. But for those of you that may ever be, put in a debate or put in a situation with your local council and the telecom companies are going to present or argue, you can be sure that they are going to take things from these playbooks, either use your testimony against you or use them to try to influence local councils. But rest assured, you cannot erase the huge body of literature that cannot confuse anyone. It should be very crystal clear. We even have peer-reviewed papers describing publication bias in the funding source describing adverse effects of microwave radiation. So for those in this 2008 paper, for those studies selected that were industry funded, only about 1/3 actually described an adverse effect. Go figure. But for those that were independently funded, they saw just the reverse. About 70% showed an adverse effect. Well, something's going on here. Now, I think it's, if you look at the totality of literature, especially before 1975, but totality of literature, I think it's well above 70. It's probably above 80% in terms of the total number of publications that show adverse effects. So yes, this is important. All right, I'm going to give just a few individual examples. I think I got maybe 5. I'll end at 4:30 here because I think it'll be a good transition so we can have plenty of discussion and questions here. Let's look at specific example. Dark field phase contrast allows us to look at red blood cells. That's what I was showing earlier as actually devices that can help blood cells that are deformed or sticking together. So that's what a clean plasma looks like. Nice spherical ones, kind of with separation in case. All right, well, this was a study using cell phones by Weston Price organization. You can look this up online. I believe it's published, but it's on their website. Many people have done similar types of experiments. So with low exposure, you start to see effects. Well, low exposure, female 75 years, healthy red blood cells. If they're just carrying the cell phone around for a certain amount of time, you can start to get these sorts of aggregates forming in your blood. And if you have active exposure, meaning you're actually using the device, you actually see the shape of the cells start to become spiky. These are called echinocytes, and that is indicative, that can, if that goes on a long time, you can get certain conditions of all kinds of different things happening. But at the same time, you can also recover from that. So if you put it down, you might be able to recover. But the point is, these things are measurable. They can happen very quickly, and they can happen at very low levels of microwave radiation. Another example, I mentioned DNA damage from the National Toxicology Program. What about the European Commission's report in 2004? They did a study where they directly compared ionizing radiation, that's gamma rays, to cell phone use. Okay, so with a DNA test, you use what's called a Comet assay. So on the left, you see a control. It's nice and spherical and beautiful, right? With gamma radiation, in this case, the equivalent of 16,000 chest X-rays, 1,600 chest X-rays, you can see like this comet formation. This means that there is DNA damage. That's how that test works. But look over here, 24 hours of mobile phone exposure, you get the same kind of pattern. You're getting DNA damage. This is 1.8 gigahertz for 24 hours. And this is called the reflex study by the European Commission. Again, there are many others that have told us the same thing. Yes, low level, non-ionizing, whatever you want to call it, microwave radiation can create these effects. Different mechanisms than X-rays, but they still happen. Okay, so the last couple examples will look a little more at the brain specifically. And this is important because your brain has a system in place called the blood-brain barrier that is supposed to protect you and the brain from all kinds of organisms, foreign material, heavy metals, viruses, you name it. That blood-brain barrier is an anatomical structure between your blood vessels and your brain that is tight, that is designed to keep things out. Now, we know there are certain things that can loosen up those tight junctions and allow things to get into the brain. In fact, I have people here at the university that do this in terms of a form of therapy. They actually use ultrasound to temporarily open the blood-brain barrier, a certain part of the brain, to make it a little bit leaky. And fairly recently in Toronto, they were actually treating patients with brain cancer, with gliomas, using chemotherapy by opening the blood-brain barrier temporarily to get drugs into the brain to treat the glioma, okay? So this is well known, well established, using different types of mechanisms where you can temporarily or permanently open the blood-brain barrier. But it has actually been known, and I don't know anybody here at the university that is aware of this other than me, unless people I talk to, that know that there's a long history of literature that microwaves can do this and create this effect. But what does that mean if people are being exposed to microwave radiation and it is affecting their blood-brain barrier? It means things that can get into their brain that they don't want to get into their brain, including aluminum and mercury, environmental things, viruses, bacteria. There are things that will get in simply because their blood-brain barrier is jeopardized and vulnerable, okay? Very important here. So, and I list 3 papers here that anybody can look up. Specifically, microwaves, permeability of the brain, blood-brain barrier. Well, let's look at one. And Dr. Leif Salford actually worked in this area, has worked in this area for decades. He originally was doing magnetic resonance imaging, those of you familiar with that, back in the 90s. And he noticed that MRIs in some cases could actually cause a little bit of leaky blood-brain barrier, which he found very interesting, and later discovered that microwaves can create dramatic vulnerabilities in the blood-brain barrier. So here you're looking at a rat brain, a slice of a rat brain, the control on the top. On the bottom, you've got 2 hours of exposure at 915 megahertz. This is very, very low exposure. In fact, multiple people have repeated these experiments over the last few decades. And it's for some reason, I don't know why, but you actually can get a more dramatic effect with lower exposures than higher exposures. And he has a YouTube, I have the link here, you can listen to him explain this. And there are multiple different groups and authors that have reported this. But what I'm showing here in this second bottom image, you see these little brown spots? Okay, what that means is they deliver an agent. In the top, the only place you see brown spots is in the back of the brain, and that's normal. There's supposed to be some leakiness here in the bottom part of the top image. But what you see in the exposed rat repeatedly are these little brown spots, and those are places that the agent that they delivered into the blood got into the brain. So it stained into the brain tissue. The brain became vulnerable to material that would not normally get into the brain. So you're directly visualizing that in this example, okay? And there's histology where you can actually look more closely in each of those spots to see how things are spreading out, okay? So there are multiple studies that look into this. This is actually looking at prenatal exposure in rats. And you will actually see changes in the morphology of neurons in the brain of neonates after they are born. You will see memory deficits in fetuses and embryos exposed in utero to very low levels. The mother was exposed, and you look at the development after they're born, you will see all kinds of deficits. Here's a great study where they go into that, dramatic changes. We even see some evidence that in humans as well, but okay. The last brain-related thing I do want to mention, I know many of you may be experiencing this, things like tinnitus. I know there's been a dramatic increase in people reporting tinnitus, which is ringing in the ears, sounds, and there may be lots of explanations or causes for that, but it has been well known for a very long time that relatively low amounts of pulsed microwave radiation can create sounds that you can perceive, and the mechanisms are actually well understood. Alan Frey, who was in that microwave debate picture I showed early on the left, he had published in 1961 the first direct peer-reviewed evidence of doing this, where he actually got psychophysical curves here showing the levels of threshold of when you can detect weak pulsed microwave radiation, and you can detect even possibly in the right conditions from your phone. But it has to be like in a quiet environment. You can do that. But most people probably, it has to be a little bit higher than that. And there's even a book by Professor Lin at University of Illinois in 1978, entire book on the microwave auditory effect and how you can do this. And it doesn't just end there. Many patents describing microwave hearing and how to develop devices to use pulse microwaves to generate sounds inside the head. And those sounds could be audible. In fact, you could create any sound that you want with the right microwave device and be perceived inside the head. I could create voice, I could talk to you inside your head. These patents describe how to build that, develop that. These patents have been around for decades, and they're public patents. They've probably been around for 75, 80 years. And there are even devices, looks like a gun, but it actually can basically send even low-level microwaves and create these effects, direct in energy. A maser is another term people use. It's like a laser, but a maser is for microwaves. Those things exist, but much of that is often classified or not commercially available exactly, some of that technology, but something you should be aware of because these things have been around for a while. So I guess, as I finish up, we have to ask, do we really want a 5G future? We know that we've been promised a lot of these things on this map, this 5G vision, the Internet of Things. But at the consequence, it's going to require a soup of microwave radiation well beyond anything that we have now. Okay, so if we could actually see things, it might look something like this with these fields, but we can't see them, and it's not visible light. But if we did have eyes that could see it, it might look something like that. The kind of devices that we're all seeing show up in our neighborhoods and our cities, universities. Some of them are obvious, like the ones on the left, and these are small cells. So most of us are familiar with the large ones. They can be at school grounds, whatever. We've had them now for 20 years. These are the new types of devices showing up, and they take many forms and functions. I know a lot of us are familiar with these on the left. You might see these. They can also be microcells that have different shapes you may not notice. There's also what we call stealth. That is actually stealthconcealment.com. You can go there, where it's all supposed to blend in with the furniture or blend in with the buildings, so they're not going to be so obvious. They have brick, churches, trees, whatever they want. They have those available. They can also put these underground. In fact, many cities have these under the portholes. Their devices there, so they can come from different directions. This is just showing exposure in Sydney. The blue is before they turned on 5G. This is at a particular park. This is from the Radio Frequency National Site Archive in Sydney, Australia. And before and after turning on 5G, this is exposure. So you can see how you get dramatic increases in exposures after 5G installation. Okay, so I'm winding down. Just to put things out there, I know this will be part of the discussion. The important thing is there's a huge amount of literature here. I've given only a few examples. And when you do want to talk to somebody else, especially local councils, these are the kind of things you want to give them, and not just the outlines. Eventually, you do want to give them the original papers, especially if you're communicating with local council or court system. You have to admit these things as evidence. You really want to think about studies that are relevant to what you're trying to argue. So this is one example that Susan Clark has used. Those of you familiar with her, and I think it's an older list, but it basically just lists the exposure on the left. All of these are really within current FCC exposure guidelines on the left. The nature of the study, the conclusion of the study there in the middle, the effect, the author doing the research, and then the year of the study. So here's a sample of those 15,000. Maybe there's 30 of them here. It will keep your local council busy saying they got to look at these and think about them and respond to those. In reality, you cannot really contest all of these. Well, they're not qualified to, but you can't really contest these because no one has been able to contest them. You'd have to do series of studies to contest each one of these, even to build an argument. So you have to build your argument another way if you're the telecom industry, if you're going to say, oh no, everything's fine, right? So there's also some books that I recommend. I have some of these here. Hidden Dangers, when it comes to microwave radiation, that is a great reference by retired Captain Flynn. Well-sourced, it'll give you the history, it'll give you little bits where you can find sources of a lot of the things I've shown here. You have to contact him directly and he'll provide the book. I do think he has a version on Amazon now, a newer version, which you can also get. But he worked in weapons for many years in the military. The Invisible Rainbow by Arthur Furstenberg is a great history. I mentioned the microwave debate, I mentioned cross currents. The last slide I have, I believe, yeah, the last slide, even though everything I talked about until now is health effects, I do understand that local councils, sometimes even beyond health effects, they seem to be more riled up when you talk about property value and the effects of property of this technology coming in that wasn't there yesterday, is here today. How does that impact your property and your value? This is from Stop Colorado group. They provided this and it kind of gives you a breakdown. Simply the installation of these towers, what we know it does to property value. So certainly, you know, there's security and other aspects I didn't even touch on. But when it comes to health effects, my take-home message, the science is established. There's so much, we would drown in the science, and challenge anybody to debate these issues. And if they claim to be experts, ask the question, A, are they familiar with these 15,000 studies? Is it part of their vocabulary? And B, do they have a background in electricity and magnetism or microwaves and biology and medicine? If they only have background in one or the other, they need to be well-versed in the literature. They have to understand, they may be able to, but if they're not falling in either of those categories, I would be very suspect listening to what they have to say, unless they're giving you sources of information, right? So I'm going to stop there, and I will let people question and answer or get into whatever discussion you want about. I know I'm not providing solutions because that's a whole nother hour or two, but we can certainly get into that. I think there's some very relatively simple things, but we can get into that. So I'm going to open that up to everybody else now.